Foreign Policy with former Ambassador Frank Lavin. But first, before I give Frank a far kinder introduction than he deserves, I've known him 30 years?
Wow.
I want to do some plugs for future events. As you know, the center, we put on programs here in Ground Zero every Tuesday this month from 5 to 6, including free turkey sandwiches, which we get from Smoke Damage Warehouse, so eat at your own risk. That was a joke. February 19th, next Tuesday, we're doing a really interesting panel called So You Need $100 Million, about what it's like to run for president nationally in a primary and how you raise all the money to do it. And we're bringing in two titans of finance, one Democratic, one Republican, Lou Sussman and Jack Oliver, who both have raised hundreds of millions of dollars, talk about how you do it, how it works, how political fundraising in the United States really works. That's going to be very interesting. It will be hosted by yours truly and Bob Schrum. And you'll learn a lot about the real world of political money, which is the first battlefield if you want to be a presidential candidate. And then a week after next, on February 26th, Bob Schrum will be in conversation with New York Times LA Bureau Chief Adam McGurney, an old warhorse from the campaign trail, a very interesting cat. He's going to talk about covering politics. And Stephanie Cutter was a high-ranking official in the Obama campaign, and former deputy campaign manager, are going to talk about the crowded field of Democrats now running for president. Tonight's event is broadcast on Facebook Live, so no monkey business. I'm delighted today to bring my old friend Frank Lavin here. Now, I'm going to give him the big over-the-top introduction because he is that qualified. Frank has served in 3 White House administrations. On the National Security Council, he ran the political operation in the Reagan White House during the last 2 years, along with Frank Donatelli, another good friend of ours from way back. He was, again, in Reagan, Bush Sr., George W. Bush, all 3 of various positions, mostly after his stint in the Reagan political office dealing with foreign policy, particularly Asia. He's lived mostly in Asia for the last 20 years. He was our American ambassador in the Bush administration to Singapore. He was undersecretary for, I think, all international trade at the U.S. Trade Representative. He's worked in Department of Commerce and State. He's what we in the political business call a lifer, although he's been in the private sector for at least more than a decade now for business that's been based both, I believe, in Hong Kong and Singapore. He's a graduate of the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. I also went there. I'm still on a leave of absence. Frank actually graduated. He is a master in Chinese language and history from Johns Hopkins and a Wharton MBA. And I probably forgot, also a master's from Georgetown. So highly qualified, highly experienced, and the right guy to talk about what's going on with trade wars, this wave of populism, and, of course, the Republican foreign policy evolution to our current Trump foreign policy, which is very different than what Frank and I and others signed up for back in the Reagan era. So we're going to talk about that for a while, and then we're going to open it up to your questions and comments. I'm going to kick it off on the topic of populism. Frank, you recently wrote an article in the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. Your essay was called Things Fall Apart, Populism and Foreign Policy. So why don't we start with kind of, for our discussion here, a definition of how you define populism, some of the antecedents of it, and where the danger to institutions may lie.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you for that.
Oh, and happy Year of the Pig.
Happy Year of the Pig. People, anybody from Singapore here? So
they heard you were coming.
Can we say Xin Nian Kuai Le? So we'll say Happy New Year to everybody. But good. We'll jump into the populism.
Yeah, I thought the Latin American parallels were interesting in your piece.
Well, first, this is a great kickoff point, Mike, because it's a somewhat of a global phenomenon, which is to say, I think it animates Brexit. I don't think Theresa May is a populist in the way we use the word in the U.S., but it's certainly the sense of alienation and the appeal of being anti-establishment we see very strongly in the U.K. We see it with Orban in Hungary. We see it in Poland. We see it with Erdogan in Turkey. We see it in various Latin American policies, and we see it very strongly in the U.S. And my question was that, can we define it? Is it simply sort of an anti-establishment politician, or is there more to it than that? And my conclusion is that in defining populism, there's sort of 4 elements that all these populists share in common, and it's not necessarily ideological, meaning you can find it on the right or you can find it on the left. So I would say by these definitions, in some ways, Bernie Sanders is very similar to Donald Trump. Obama has some elements of it, but stylistically very different. But there are elements of this across the political spectrum. At least Trump is sort of the most, how do we say, the most sort of theatrical person in this space. But what are the elements? What are these four elements? One is that populism is typically grievance-based. The political leader wants to focus his argumentation around what is wrong, what is the problem. And so that gives a message potency, because negative impulses can be more powerful than positive ones. But it also suggests that person's going to have a harder time governing, because a person spent more time thinking about the problem than thinking about the solution, and because a group of people, a broad group of people, can agree on the nature of a problem, but they don't necessarily agree on that solution. So you haven't necessarily built a governing coalition or performance like. But grievances is one point. A second point is emotional connectivity, that the populist leader relies more on that personal, emotional dimension of communication than a establishment person who might put out a position paper or white paper or congressional testimony or even write a book or something, and the populist leader relies much more on that individual relationship. So no surprise that Trump's most favored campaign mechanism is a rally, a large-scale rally which has a significant emotional content to it, and he will eschew typically small group meetings or discussions or roundtables or individual meet and greets where there's actually retail politics taking place, and rely on that kind of emotional dimension of communications. A third element of populism, third of the four, is that populism tends to be exculpatory. It tends to say that the problems that are faced are not our doing. We are the victims. Right? So if we have problems in U.S. manufacturing, it's because somebody's cheating, right? It's not that pay raises in certain industries have outpaced efficiency improvements, or it's not that the industry has evolved, or that consumer taste has evolved, or the technology is in play. It's somebody is cheating us. We have not made any wrong decisions. Or even matters such as drug use. We're saying we have a problem with illegal drugs because foreigners are selling drugs to us, not because people are making bad decisions. Right? So it absolves you of any possible bad decision. So we see a lot of exculpatory rhetoric in Trump's discussions. And the fourth element, I'd say, of populism is typically public policy pronouncements don't see any trade-offs. That there's a solution out there and we're going to push the solution. And there's no cost to this. There's no cost to this. We're going to go down the right path. So we see elements of this in Trump talking about the wall with Mexico. In fact, his initial claim for several years is not only is this helpful, it's free. It's free. So there's no cost to this at all. We're going to get just a net sort of economic, political gain by building this wall, and there's zero cost to this function. It's a little bit similar to the rhetoric Obama used on health care to say, look, we've got this problem. Some people don't have health insurance or access to health care. We're going to put it in place. And there's not going to be a cost to this. It is actually going to save us money. Right? So it's a freebie. And the people who are against this must not understand fully what we're suggesting here, because it's good news for everybody if we can put this in place. Right? So populism will, I don't think it's as strong with Obama as it has been with Trump, but it's there. So that's how I define the four characteristics of populism.
I thought it was interesting you looked at Chavez, and there's a line that Chavez was using that reminds me a lot of a Trump rally, which is, he said, "I am the people. I demand absolute loyalty to me because I'm not an individual. I am the people." And Trump's rallies are all couched in the language of we. Us and them, we. And it's a simple solution, as you say. We just need the political will to force it to our enemies, who are, of course, evil and therefore have no justification to oppose us.
No, I think that's pretty fair. We might say that personality-led is maybe a better term for the emotional-led, that it's personality. And I think also we see this, I don't think I'd compare Trump to Maduro, but we see this with people who might not, if you don't have a lot of depth in policy and crafting legislation and sort of understanding how government ministries work, you tend not to use that as your mechanism for evaluating decisions, what you tend to say, one of the reasons it's personality-driven is because the people might not have depth on policy. So if you said, I can't really tell you if this is a good idea or not, I don't have a way of measuring if it's a good idea or not, but I can tell if you like me or not. And that's what's important. So loyalty becomes the supreme value.
Right.
Internal cohesion becomes very important in a populist polity.
Which leads to the tribalism we have now. I'm right, you're evil. And everybody goes into their corner. Now, do you think this, because we've seen it in the UK, to some extent with the French Yellow Vest protest, we've seen Eastern European, Europe, you can argue Putin's a populist of sorts.
Yeah.
Does it rotate, do you think, or we're going to be stuck in this populism as the new reality of American politics for a decade, even if Trump is replaced by a less coarse populist of the left?
Yeah, but first let me endorse your comment on Putin. I think he very much is victimization. All of the problems in Russia today are because somebody's been mean to us, right? So you hear that replete in his
humiliated.
Yeah. So he gloms onto that very much so, and it is this politics of personality where you have him going out hunting the wild boar, him going out and finding the Greek urn and the Caspian Sea. I mean, it's almost a Kim Jong-un kind of message out there. But on your second question about is this a permanent, I think some elements of what Trump is doing are going to have a lasting effect. But I don't think populism itself is the way to go. And in fact, what typically happens in U.S. politics is the political trends tend to be a correction or an overcorrection from recent flaws. So,
Right.
Instead of saying the real problem in America today is that NATO is not burden sharing, if that degrades NATO cohesion and NATO's ability to act, that kind of pronouncements, we might find the next president saying, look, I'm not as concerned about burden sharing as I am that we have a functioning collaborative alliance that will actually move when we need to move. So my job in NATO is not to step on people's toes, but to try to move people our way.
Right. Yeah, no, my view is that the upside of populism is what we in the Hollywood world call, cheap applause, because it's so easy. The downside of populism is it's expensive. Companies from metal-bending states like my hometown in Detroit are now paying more for steel. That's not good. That's not what was promised here. So I think there's a good chance it cycles out. To the coarseness of the public debate, that may be hard to put back in the bottle.
I think you're right about that, and I think also some of our international architecture. Look, I think America is, in general, is wary of international involvement, which probably a good instinct. But at the same time, there's a general view of saying you've got to play some role internationally. So we had a kind of equilibrium, I would say, from the end of World War II through the Cold War, a kind of equilibrium about what our international posture should be and what defines that. A reasonable bipartisan consensus on those points. My concern is once you degrade that, once you step out of that architecture, what allows you to build it back up again? Because Americans don't get excited about international roles. So you're potentially throwing away something that is of value to us, and it's going to be hard to reconstitute it.
You circulate a lot in elite and political leadership circles in Asia. How do you think the leadership of the PRC, the Australians, the Japanese, the Singapore, they haven't seen a tweeting populist applause line, unpolicy, sophisticated president at the top of the lone, for now, superpower. It was funny. I was over in Europe, invited over to speak to a bunch of the private wealth families there, and one famous multi-billion dollar family entity there said, you guys, the Americans, we're used to you being the metronome beat, and now it's ticking in a funny way. We're not quite sure how to react.
Right.
How do the Asian political leaders react to this Trump thing? Is it splash in the pan to wait out? Is it truly dangerous? They don't know. They don't understand him. I'm curious how they read it from their
Yeah,
point of
it's
view.
look, this is a heterogeneous part of the world. It's not like Europe that has sort of continental-wide institutions like the EU or defense agreements or even NATO. So it's very different where you have countries at vastly different size, vastly different levels of development. You have Buddhist countries, Hindu countries, Christian countries, sort of secular countries, and you have a range of political structures as well. So it's very hard to say here's how Asia views Trump. I think you'd say there's some consternation among the allies, Japan, Australia, Thailand, sort of allies, some consternation because of that decrease in predictability. That they want to be able to have a functioning relationship with the United States that requires high degree of coordination, communication, predictability, and that's, in the sense, that's degraded. At the same time, there's, I think, general respect or appreciation for President Trump's, more forward-leaning approach toward North Korea. I mean, I've got my own criticisms about some things he's done, but boy, he worked to stop two very unhealthy trends in North Korea. One is they were doing nuclear testing, and two, they were doing overflights. So there is a general view that those were both sort of reckless, and there's a potential for all sorts of miscalculations when people are doing that, and they're both illegal. So Trump helped at least put them back in a box, so to speak, or stop those two tendencies. I think there's also consternation I have to add about Trump stepping backwards on trade. Even if people might agree with him on some of the criticism of China, there were some trade opportunities out there, the TPP, that people want that connectivity with the United States. So TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, was a proposal to set up a free trade area that involved 11 countries. And as Mike's noted, I mean, Bernie Sanders came out against it in his campaign, which kind of forced Hillary Clinton to come out against it, although she helped write it. So it was a little, I don't know if it helped her a lot to do that, but she sort of felt obligated to do that. And I think Trump says, I'm going to be the protectionist here. I'm not going to let anybody beat me on this issue, so I'm against it as well. So the United States sort of moved backwards on some of the trade issues, and I think that's unfortunate for U.S. connectivity in the region. And a lot of our trading partners felt, boy, this was the opportunity to move in. And China is stepping up on some of these issues, right? So I think most of the mid-sized countries say, look, we're happy to engage economically with China, but we feel a lot more comfortable the U.S. is also involved in the region. So we want sort of as much space as possible. And if there's only one major power active in the region, that's a constraint.
You know, it's interesting. I would watch Trump in his speeches talk about how our trade negotiators are all knuckleheads and the Chinese were running circles around them. They're giving away the store every day. You were one of those trade negotiators. Yeah. Do you think over the last 15 years we've given away the store to China?
No, I thought the United States was very much on the right track. And it was not just, I mean, I was involved for the last few years, but it's really since World War II is that one of the post-World War II building blocks for U.S. presence, and we thought for a more stable and prosperous world, was move toward open systems. So we have international financial institutions like IMF and the World Bank, and we also have international trading bodies like the GATT and WTO, and these can serve as mechanisms for regulating international behavior and moving toward more open states, more open societies. And my view, that's what gets you the best outcome, that if people are allowed to trade and invest and participate as they see fit, you're going to have more prosperity. You can each play to your comparative advantage. You have more connectivity. So there's a lot of advantages. And that indeed had been the trend in the United States for 70-some years. Again, a parallel, the first president in this modern era who ran against trade and won was Barack Obama. And Obama, if you look at his campaign activity, very similar to Trump's. We're going to renegotiate NAFTA. NAFTA has harmed America. And in fact, if you'll recall, I know this is a younger crowd, so we're going back a few years, but if you recall during the campaign, President Obama's economic advisor, Austin Goolsbee, was sort of so troubled by this, but he sort of viewed it as campaign posturing, that he met with Canadian counterparts and said, look, don't worry about this. He's just kind of got to say this in a campaign. Well, that immediately leaks out. We're going back about 10 years. That immediately leaks out that Senator Obama gives a talk saying we've got to renegotiate NAFTA and it really hurt America. And the Canadians have been reassured simultaneously, don't, nothing's going to happen. That leaks out. So Obama has to repudiate his own guy, Goolsbee, and say, you shouldn't have said that because I mean what I said. Now, as it turns out, Goolsbee was right. Obama didn't push renegotiating NAFTA, but he didn't move aggressively on other things. But, you know, he at least got TPP finished, but he never docked that ship. So you could see then 10 years ago that there were hints of populism and fatigue about trade, and again, exculpatory. The problems we have in America today is because of trade, but we say the good news in America today is because of trade. But look, trade does perform a stratification function, meaning there's some people and some companies who have the skills and are nimble and can take advantage of a more open system, and there's some folks who can't or won't. And so there is a distribution effect of trade. And not surprisingly, the folks who have the product or the system or the company that can win, I would say this is a pretty good deal. And folks who have had maybe a privileged position or don't have the skills or the product to win are disgruntled. And then, as we said a minute ago, also people who might have made their own share of mistakes, but they don't want to say that, will say, well, it's Japan Steel or China Steel or somebody's being unfair to us. So what we'd say, I mean, the harsh reality is good news for some, but bad news for some. And the harsh reality is this: it has never been easier for a U.S. company to compete in another country's market. That's the good news. And we all can guess the other side of the coin is it's never been easier for a foreign company to compete in the U.S. market. Now, that's great for consumers. That's great for companies that need inputs in their manufacturing process, and there's a foreign supplier as part of their production process. So it's certainly good for some companies. But boy, if you were the U.S. Steel company, you're saying, I've got competition now that I didn't have before, and I'm not happy about it. So there's going to be, if you're making autos, you're saying, this is fantastic because the foreign inputs of steel, not that we use a lot of foreign steel, but it drives the price down. It caps the prices that the domestic firms can charge. So it's a boon economically for the consumers of steel. The auto company, construction industry, white goods industry are better off. But if you're manufacturing this, you might be under pressure, right? So that's the lay of the land when you have a more open system.
How do you think the trade war ends? Where are we going? Get out the old crystal ball here.
Yeah, I think, look, I think Trump likes a few things. I'm looking at this sort of like behavioral psychology rather than as a trade economist. Behavioral psychology tells me we can make a few predictions about Trump. He enjoys disruption. He enjoys being the bad cop. He enjoys telling people that they're malfeasant. And, he might be right on some of these things. But this is a typical opening act of President Trump is you're not doing a good job, you're not being fair to me, and you need to stop that. So he enjoys that. Another thing we need about Trump is that he loves being the hero of his own story. So if he lights a fire, he's got to put out the fire too. So he can be both the arsonist and the fire marshal. So I'm saying, look, this is going to come to an end. He's not there to say this is a long-term problem or it's intractable or I can only solve part of that. He's there to be a hero. So you have him saying rather grandiose statements, rather categorical statements saying NAFTA was the worst trade deal done in the history of America, but I fixed it. So he's saying it both absolutist on the negative side and absolutist on the positive side. The other point
and the truth would be
the truth is that it liberalized trade in North America, and we've done some really exciting things with, say, auto production, where auto production is integrated across all three NAFTA countries. So in some respects, for some autos, the United States is the best manufacturing platform in the world for auto production. So no surprise, BMW has moved a lot of its export production to the United States. No surprise that all of the Japanese majors and all the Korean majors have moved production to the United States. Not just that U.S. is a great home market, a great consumer market, but also it's the best market. If you're a Korean auto company, you're gonna ship to Asian markets out of Korea, but you'll ship to Europe markets out of the U.S. You'll ship to Latin America out of the U.S. because we're a great platform. So huge boon to the U.S. economy to say we want to be the best platform in the world for manufacturing. But if you do that, you're giving something up. What you're giving up is you're saying, look, the low end, more labor intensive manufacturing, we don't mind if that goes to Mexico. Or if a Japanese auto company in the U.S. wants to source some element of its production from Japan or elsewhere, we don't mind that either. We want this to be lowest cost, most efficient production, because then you're going to put your production in our market. But it almost requires that some of the production is going to be done elsewhere. So that's sort of where we were when Trump came into office, and that's NAFTA and other trade agreements. And what Trump said is, look, that's the wrong way to go. That's wrong, because you're going to have manufacturing activity that has historically been done in the U.S. moving offshore. We don't want that. So what we're going to do is attenuate. We're going to slow down some of this integrated auto market so that it's more expensive to do work in Mexico, so we're going to save these jobs here. I called that another essay I wrote. That is the hubcaps forever theory of manufacturing. To say, look, our goal here in the United States is whatever we are doing now in manufacturing, it should be our national policy that we'll keep doing those tasks and making those products in perpetuity.
Yeah, steam locomotives. They're hard to find now because we didn't protect them enough.
Yeah.
But what and the Chinese trade spat, where do you think it lands?
To go back to my point
to give
about
Trump a win, or at least something he pretends to
Look,
win.
First of all, I think a lot of his criticism is well placed. I think China doesn't abide by world norms, and it has protectionist policies in some sectors. It has asymmetrical tariffs in some sectors. It has compulsory IP licensing. So I think there are a lot of service industries the U.S. is banned from participating in. So I think some of these complaints, a lot of these complaints, I think are valid. So China's got room to improve, as we say. And I think they will. I mean, I think they take Trump somewhat seriously, and they know that he has raised the stakes pretty high, and he's put himself personally into it, and needs to come out with something that satisfies them. Now, will they solve half of these problems, or a quarter of these problems, or 10 or 20%? It's very hard to say. But my guess is they move, and they do solve some of them, and Trump banks the wins. We'll know in a few weeks. But then Trump says, I'm keeping the 10% tariffs in place. As you know, he applied 10% tariffs, and he said, but I can take these up to 25% if I'm not happy, and you have 90 days to fix what's broken, and we're giving you a list of, I think, 150-some complaints, and you've got to fix this. So I think you will see movement, and I think Trump will declare victory, and I think some percentage of that list gets fixed. But he says, you know what, that was the opening act. We need to do this again on keeping the 10% into place.
So you're a dyed-in-the-wool Reaganite. We came up together in those years. Yeah. And yet you're one of the Republican foreign policy mandarins who signed the letter endorsing Hillary Clinton when Trump ran. Yeah. What motivated that? What motivated that? And looking at the Republican foreign policy now, which I'm sure you were afraid would change, how bad is it on your internal scorecard against what you were expecting? And do you think we'll rotate back to a more traditional, more internationalist, more free trade, more Atlantic alliance-oriented foreign policy going forward?
And look, that exactly sums up why, at least on international affairs, I thought Hillary Clinton was a better choice than Donald Trump, because I think, she's sort of establishment-oriented, and the core elements of sort of U.S. foreign policy establishment is these alliance relationships are important, that they're a force multiplier for the U.S., and it's a mechanism for us to listen to like-minded countries. They might have different point of views, but at least we've got a consultative process where people's societies and political orientation is very similar to ours, and so we need to keep those kind of conversations going and have a formal alliance structure behind it. So I think she basically would come from that point of view. And Trump, I think, says, look, foreign policy is basically all cost and no benefit. We don't get a lot out of it. It costs a lot of money. A lot of these issues around the world don't involve us. By the way, that's also somewhat similar, I think, in worldview to Obama. Very different style, but somewhat similar to say, we're overextended. It's too costly, and what we need to do is decrease our international presence. So that, to my mind, Hillary Clinton's position on those issues was just more appealing in terms of where is U.S. national interest and what do we want to get out of foreign policy.
Has Trump exceeded your dire expectations in any way?
Yeah, I am surprised at his desire for disruption even when the situation doesn't require it. Yeah. And you say, look, there's a theatrical benefit, but you don't need to do that if you're already president. If you're on a TV show or if you're a presidential candidate, maybe you need to be sort of theatrical to capture the spotlight, but you are the president of the most powerful country in the world. People are going to listen to you even if you're sedate or even if you're understated. So what is the point in getting in a quarrel with Canada? What is the value in denigrating Mexico? How does that advance U.S. national interest? And what you have to say is, look, the conclusion you come, if you say he's not an irrational guy, he's doing this for some purpose, the conclusion you come to is saying, look, foreign policy requirements are much less important than a domestic political benefit I might achieve. And I'm playing to that segment of the domestic audience in the U.S., which might not evaluate a particular foreign policy move, but they can evaluate my demeanor and my friction. And they warm to that, and they want a president who says I'm doing a good job because I am stepping on toes.
If Trump is reelected and we have 4 more years of this populist Republican foreign policy, which is so new, it was an internationalist party for so long, do you think significant damage will be done to our alliances and our relations around the world?
Yeah, I do, because, look, this architecture was put in place post-World War II. And I think it was very important for our sort of Cold War posture internationally. Then you get to the post-Cold War, and now we're sort of post-Cold War, so we're beyond that considerably. And I look, it's reasonable to inquire, well, what do we need? So I don't say Trump or Obama are intrinsically foolish, just saying maybe we do need to change our posture, do things differently in this moment. But I think that ought to be sort of discussions and thought through, and you come to some kind of conclusion. You don't do it by unilateral moves or insulting people. So, you know, what was my problem with Donald Trump was he goes to the first NATO summit, which he participates, and he berates his counterparts for insufficient contribution. Look, he might have a fair point there, but I think he's going about it very much the wrong way, where it's only going to generate ill will. Obama, for his part, across 8 years, reduced U.S. NATO commitment by about 20%. So you say, boy, that's a potential risky move as well. We could be paying the price for it now. But so I think both of them had sort of misplaced attitudes towards our international commitments. But, you know, the paradox here is you only know after the fact. You say, I'm saving money by reducing my capabilities internationally, and, you know, everybody says that looks fine, looks like you saved some money.
Yeah.
But maybe 4 years later, 5 years later, or 2 years later, something happens, and you say, where's the fire department?
Well, you get into the paradox of minute early versus minute late.
Yeah. So this is kind of the choice. Deterrence theory and our international posture is based, in shorthand, is based on the theory of a minute early. Meaning you've got 2 choices in international crisis management. Are you going to be a minute early and try to avoid a crisis, or are you going to be a minute late and respond to a crisis? And deterrence theory and architecture and forward deployment says, look, we want to be a minute early. We want to have friends, we want to have troops, we want to have resources, we want to be able to deter problems, right? And being a minute late says, look, that's expensive. That's a permanent political, military establishment, and it's costly. And by the way, not only is it costly, but it might induce bad decisions. If you've got troops overseas or troops around, you might misuse them or get into wars you shouldn't get into. So there's a potential cost for being a minute early. If you're a minute late, well, you got a huge problem because the crisis has already taken place, but you've got a huge advantage in that you'll have a domestic political consensus for saying we better do something, and you're sort of saving this money. So what we'd say is all the presidents in the modern era from World War II up until Barack Obama said, look, we better be a minute early. We better have treaties. We better have forward deployed troops, meaning military presence overseas. We better have consultative mechanisms. We've got to have this alliance network, and we want to make sure bad things don't happen. And this is primarily designed for the Cold War, for the Soviet Union. Obama was sort of saying, look, we just don't need that. We don't need it. And in fact, the Exhibit A, why it's a bad idea, is Iraq. That this was just a disaster, and we went in there, and it just didn't work out at all. So we're not going to do that. We're going to pull back, shrink the military, reduce defense commitments.
His pitch was kind of, we're going to be right on time, which, of course, is a priori impossible.
Yeah, I would say in the real world, we're not going to have a Hollywood ending. We're not going to have the spy sneak into the terrorist camp and defuse the nuclear weapon right at time and say, boy, you saved that. Hollywood ending is there. And you don't want to base a foreign policy on the hope that a Hollywood ending comes true. You're either going to say, in this kind of world we're in, look, we've got intelligence that terrorists are planning something. This is the intelligence. You've got to make a decision. Do we act on this intelligence? Are we going to be a minute early? Or do we wait till something takes place and we say, well, now we know for certainty we were right or we were wrong, but the terrorist attack took place. I think most people would say, look, in some form or fashion, we've got to be a minute early. I mean, depending what kind of intelligence you have or what the threat is, but if you're picking up communication that somebody's going to put a bomb in a U.S. city, somebody better do something about that. Even though there might be an error rate there, or there might be something else going on, right? But you better be prepared to take action.
The theory is always that the error of a minute early is never as catastrophic as the error of a minute late.
Well, that's exactly it. That's exactly, well, and especially if we're talking about nuclear devices. If you're saying, look, I doubt what we know now that Saddam Hussein was going to do anything. right? He was trying to buy uranium. He stopped the International Atomic Energy Commission from inspections. So there were signals he might be doing something. But for what we know when we went to it, it doesn't look like he had anything going on. So I think if you were talking to a scientist now or military strategist now, they would say something like, look, there's probably only a 10 or 20% chance that Saddam Hussein would have had a nuclear device in over 10 years or something like that. Pretty small chance. And then there's probably even a smaller chance they would actually use it. Right? So maybe there's a 10 or 20% chance he would have developed it, and maybe, then another small percentage on that they'd actually use it. So we'd have to go, it's a democracy, we'd have to go to people here to say, are you comfortable with that? Are you okay with that? That a guy said, I don't want nuclear inspections. I don't have a bomb right now. I do have some nuclear weapon programs going, but nothing, I don't have anything going. Is that okay? Is that okay? I'm violating my treaty. I am, doing some tiny steps towards a bomb. I'm violating my agreements. I've invaded other countries before. I've used weapons of mass destruction before. Are you comfortable with me where I am right now, or you do want to do something about it? Look, I have a feeling we're going to have a replay of these kind of issues throughout, the near term. It might be Algeria, it might be some other country, but there's going to be somebody where you're picking up signals that there's some kind of nuclear program underway, and it's going to be for the people in this room to decide, not me, but you're going to have to make a call on this to say at what threshold of intelligence do you encounter before you say, you know what, we better go do something about this.
Okay, with that, let's open up for some questions, comments, insults. Just show of hands, we got a mic runner here.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
There he goes.
All right.
Good.
I'm going to start quizzing you if there are no questions. Okay. Yes, sir, right there. Here, let's get the mic for you so we can all hear.
Thank you. So I guess this isn't exactly in regards to what you were just talking about, but in terms of your experience in working, I guess, in the State Department and in China, what do you think the biggest thing that's changed since like the fall of the Soviet Union and I guess the switch in power from like that red center to the red center that is China today? And how do you think things have changed over your lifetime?
Yeah, look, I think I don't think it'd be fair analysis to sort of equate China today with the Soviet Union. And I think what's important to note is that the Soviet Union saw itself as a global leader of a communist movement, and was in a global geopolitical competition with the West. And whether that involved funding guerrilla movements or invasions or at the strategic level, it was a broad coalition against them. China's, I can't say has never viewed itself that way, but certainly since the death of Mao in the modern era for several decades, it said, look, view us more as a traditional great power or a emerging great power, not a company that views it as a global geopolitical mission. And in fact, it's highly nationalist, I would say, in its foreign policy. And if you look through traditional Chinese history, no surprise what you see, which its overwhelming view of its foreign policy requirements are border security. And this is for thousands of years of Chinese history. To say, what is your philosophy? The philosophy is saying national security depends on being able to project force among our immediate neighbors. That's our view, which, by the way, is a classical foreign policy dictate. So there shouldn't be any surprise that that's the approach of foreign policy. Now, it can build beyond that. It can escalate. There can be sort of mission creep and bracket creep, because if you say, all I really need to do is take care of my borders, you say, well, that sounds reasonable. Then you say, but you know what? Right outside my borders are countries, and right outside my other countries, and I just need regional force projection capabilities. So you do have sort of a growing view of what constitutes security. But look, I don't think it's surprising, and I don't think it's necessarily hostile. But I'd say this: there's sort of two views of security. Where does peace come from, right? What constitutes peace for the United States? What constitutes for China, or you could say for any country? And I'd say there's sort of two philosophical approaches here. One is that peace comes from being able to dominate your neighbors. Nobody's going to attack us because we're the biggest kids around, right? You need to say, well, all right, that's probably intellectually valid. Now, that might have some instability embedded as well, but you can't say that's a flawed approach. But there might be a better approach. They say peace comes from stability, or we would say in clinical terms, peace comes from a balance of power. To say every country in the system understands that the benefits of bad behavior, the benefits of military activity, would be exceeded by the costs. So you're not going to get anything by invading your neighbor, right? So we have a stable system that comes from sort of mutual understanding of the costs and benefits of activity, right? Now, in my view, that's more durable, and that animates a lot of U.S. thinking and Western thinking too, that if you want to keep Russia from invading a country, you have to hold out consequences for them that are costly, right? I don't think that's China's view. I don't think that's China's view. I don't think that fits with Chinese history. Chinese history tells us if we dominate our neighbors, we are a bit hegemonic perhaps, but we're sure safe. And if we are weaker than our neighbors, which has happened over extended periods of Chinese history, they dominate us, and they call the shots. And we do not want to be that category, so we're going to be in the first category. So you can look, these two philosophies aren't 100% exclusive, but you can see how there could be points of friction, right? And right now there's territorial disputes in the South China Sea, where China has asserted that these territories are sovereign Chinese territory, but that's not really recognized by any other power. But the point is they might be in a position 10 years from now or 20 years from now where they assert sovereign control, and that would be a friction point with the U.S.
Yeah, they just say, why don't we get to do a Monroe Doctrine? It's our lake. It's an American move. We learned it from you. I've been interested to watch the great Kissinger-Nixon traditional balance of power equation of isolating the Russians by opening China. Sure. Now under some assault as Trump manages to alienate a lot of people, with the Chinese and the Russians starting to communicate and having the first steps toward a closer relationship. That's terrible for us geopolitically.
I think you hit on the head, Mike. You know, the IR students here will remember, call to mind Bismarck's dictum, which Kissinger kind of adapts, but Bismarck said, in a world of five, meaning there's only five powers in the world, in a world of five, always be among the three, right? So all you need are two friends, and you're okay, right? Kissinger applied this in Cold War terms to the U.S.-China-Soviet relationship, and he said what is important for U.S. security is the U.S. be closer to both China and Russia than those two countries are close to each other. So we're always going to be the preferred partner, and the other fellow will be the less preferred partner, which more or less worked. China definitely saw the Soviet Union as expansionist and predatory. And this relates to the previous question about, look, are they suggestion that is this sort of, are they supplanting Soviet Union as sort of an adversary to say, look, the Soviet Union had an international ideology. China said, look, what we care about is our country, our national security. So it's a very different approach. So it was easy for China to say, we don't get excited about the Soviet Union. And all the Soviet Union could say, yeah, but we're communist brothers, right? They'd say, I'm not sure if that's a governing philosophy for international relations, but sure, we'll all show up at the same meetings together. We'll have the hammer and sickle on our flag, but we're not necessarily excited about what you're doing.
Other questions? We got the mic here, our fleet-footed mic runner. I'm half blind by light, too, so wave your hand if you got one. A follow-up here. No, go ahead.
Based on what you just said, that they're not like the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So in terms of like our positioning militarily, in terms of our positions like in Japan and South Korea, insofar as like the Soviet Union is no longer there, and you say China is not like the Soviet Union, what justifies those positions, and how do you see them evolving going into the future? Because
you mean like Okinawa?
Right, and like Okinawa, our positions in South Korea, and our like intense military involvement like the Philippines and stuff like that. Because if China isn't a Soviet Union, why do we need to kind of almost treat them like one? Or do you see that those
no, I think
not
this
as
is sort of the overlap point I pointed to, meaning, first of all, it keys into sort of a historical view that we better be a minute early. You better have allies and forward deployment and do naval exercises with Japan. You better do that. You've got a stable, prosperous Asia, in part because U.S. acts as a guarantor, right? So that's part of the answer. I think well, maybe that's the whole answer. It was a reminder to me that Mao's statement early on, where it said, look, we welcome the U.S. presence. We want the U.S. and Japan, because we don't just view Japan as a poorly behaved neighbor. We view Japan as a chronically or permanently poorly behaved neighbor. And we know they're going to behave better if they integrate with you guys, because you have a disciplined military, you don't have an imperial tradition, your military is under civilian control, and you were their adversaries as much as we were. So you're going to play a helpful role in working. Now, this was a generation ago, but this was the leading Chinese view, to say this is not objectionable that you have close military relations with Japan. I'm sure they don't find it as welcome today.
Yeah. The Asian allies, too, like having American force projection there. The South Koreans, for example, because they know if they ever attack, they're not attacked alone. It's a tripwire force, as they say. And the Japanese now, who are, I think, concerned about rivalry in the area, having a presence there, even though it's unpopular in Japanese domestic politics, it kind of binds us together. And in the age of Trump, they're particularly insecure about the reliability of the American alliance. So we started pulling troops back around the world. They will interpret that as a retreat. And if there's a retreat, they go make deals with somebody else. And it's not in our strategic interest to have the Chinese totally dominate Asia, either Finlandize people or have such strong economic military ties that we're the isolated one, hiding behind our oceans, borrowing Chinese money to pay our army.
Yeah, and look, there's I think China's not internationally a predatory power, but there's a risk factor there, and I think U.S. presence reduces that risk. And the risk factor is something like this: in the short run, doctrine determines capabilities. You buy the force you need according to your military philosophy, your doctrine. So in the short run, doctrine determines capabilities, but in the long run, capabilities can determine doctrine. Meaning, once you develop power projection capabilities for legitimate needs, you have an inducement to then project. And where does that stop? How does that end? Does the Chinese system allow for self-restraint or pullbacks, or we're spending too much, or we've now done it, we're okay, we just want to South China Sea? Or does the Chinese system mean saying, look, we're going to spend 10 years not move, but then 10 years from now you're going to see another move on that? Well, I'd say the answer is we don't know. That there's an element of automaticity in policy making that can sometimes take hold. So China built an aircraft carrier. They bought an old Russian aircraft carrier and they retrofitted it, and it's a functioning aircraft carrier. Then they said, we're going to build our own carrier. We're going to do that. Well, I can tell you, China has 3 naval commands, geographical commands. You're not going to have a military set up like China with one military command getting an aircraft carrier. It's not any more than you could have in a U.S. military command. So you're going to have 3 functioning aircraft carriers. Then you're going to have a training command that gets an aircraft. So the point is, they're going to be building out for 10, 20, 30 years. Tell me what happens after that. And look, you can have, I think, reasonable talks with Chinese leadership where they say, here's what we're doing, and here's why you shouldn't be threatened by it, even though nobody outside of China likes their moves in the South China Sea. But the point is, nobody's a Chinese leader today can make a guarantee for what might happen 20 years from now. So I'd say, boy, I would recommend anybody on the U.S. defense establishment, you better keep your forces in place. They form a useful role.
They do look like they're trying to guarantee who's going to be the premier in 20 years. They're moving in that direction. It's a funny thing about military bureaucracies. I was a consultant at the Pentagon, and Frank was a naval officer in the reserves for a long time. I once asked a 3-star admiral, boy, you guys like to buy billion-dollar aircraft carriers. And a Russian admiral would say they're not that hard to sink with a $500,000 nuclear torpedo. And why does the Navy agree? He said, well, every time we buy an aircraft carrier, we have to buy 20 destroyers and submarines to protect it. So that's 21 captains. There's kind of a, and so these things do tend to escalate themselves. Last question, if there are any. If not, we're going to end with a tradition here at the center, a quick book plug. Frank also, in his copious spare time, recently wrote a book published by the Ohio University Press about people your age, particularly his father's history as a combat infantryman in World War II. So maybe do a minute and a half on that, and
Thanks.
where it can be bought by impoverished students is quite good.
That's right. Thanks, Mike, for that. It's a look at the U.S. Army in Europe in World War II as seen through my dad's role as combat infantryman. So people who like the Ken Burns documentary or Saving Private Ryan, if you want to look at the foot soldier and what they're doing under moments of extreme stress, and you'd say on the one hand everybody has a moral code, and I think most people do function in a moral setting. On the other hand, very few of us actually get pushed to the limit or under long periods of stress where social norms deteriorate and behavior deteriorates and the survival instinct now competes with that moral impulse. So what happens to American teenagers and American college freshmen who are put in places of extreme stress, and how wise or foolish can they be in these situations? And so it's a interesting book. It's called Homefront to Battlefront. Yeah, it's on Amazon. It's probably the best place to get it. Barnes & Nobles has it and so forth has it. But if you do read it, I'd be interested in your feedback and hearing from you. So thanks for giving it consideration, and let me know how you like it.
So last plug, next week, how to raise $100 million with two really big national fundraisers from each party, how it really works in the world of political money, which there's a lot of talk about but little knowledge. And then the Tuesday after that, Bob Strum will have a conversation with Adam Nagurney from the New York Times and Stephanie Cutter from the Obama campaign about all these candidates running, what's really going on. So with that, thank you very much for attending our event today. And thank you, Frank Lavin.
Thank you.